Дамы и господа, президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
Спасибо. Прошу вас.
A new prime minister, a new government, a new job for Dmitry Medvedev, and proposed constitutional changes. The opening act of Russia's 2024 drama is beginning to unfold. Russia's Potemkin institutions are effectively ceremonial camouflage to obscure the reality of oligarchic and personal rule. But how they are shuffled, positioned, and manipulated provides hints about how that rule will be structured. And we just got a bunch of data points to start connecting. What happens next? Well, let's take a look. Hello from SIPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome back, Don.
Great to be back to both of you.
Great to have you back. And also joining us in the studio is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome back, Maria.
Hello, Brian.
So, Putin gave his annual State of the Nation speech this week and proposed a series of constitutional changes which have kept us busy over the past 24 hours. Among these are giving the Duma the power to appoint the prime minister and the cabinet, with the president retaining the right to fire the cabinet and appoint top security officials in consultation with the Federation Council. There's some interesting nuances here that we can get into. Putin also proposed making the State Council, the Государственный Совет, which is currently a advisory body, kind of an obscure advisory body, a constitutional body. And I see this as very significant. I've been looking at this for a couple of years now, and this possibility has been floated. We'll get into that in a minute. Now, after Putin's speech, Medvedev resigned, and Putin announced his intention to appoint him to a newly created post, deputy head of the Security Council. Putin also named the obscure head of Russia's tax service, Mikhail Mishustin. I'm going to have to learn to pronounce that one properly. Mishustin as the prime minister. Now, my initial takeaways are as follows. Putin's laying the groundwork for two potential politburos. The State Council and the Security Council, where real power will lie. And we can get into because I'm not sure which of these councils is going to be the true Politburo, or, Maria, as you suggested in a piece yesterday, where Putin is kind of diffusing power among different bodies, and which gives him a lot more room to maneuver. We can get into that in a minute. My other takeaway is also he's keeping his options open with the presidency and the government. Putin appears to be maintaining flexibility about whether to keep the presidency strong and remain president, or downgrading the office and make the real seat of power elsewhere, either the State Council or the Security Council, or establish multiple centers of power, giving him the ability to migrate among them as necessary. This is just the opening move, and there's a lot more moves to come in this drama. But those are my initial takeaways, and I put them into a piece I also put out today. Maria, you and I had companion pieces that took a look at that. What's your take, Maria? How do you see this?
So first of all, what is not new about everything that happened yesterday?
I didn't think anything was new, but I thought it was interesting.
No. I just wanted to mention to our audience that key takeaways are, first of all, the transition has become the power transfer, or also known as Putin's way to stay in power forever, has started yesterday. We have been talking about that. We have been predicting it. We didn't really expect it to start as soon as it did, but it did.
I have some thoughts on that, but I want you to finish your thought.
And the second point is the scenario, the form in which this transfer will occur also has become more clear. I do not think Belarus scenario is likely anymore.
I still think the Belarus annexation is on the table, just for other reasons.
Exactly. or Lukashenko is still in trouble. Second is that Putin doesn't want to probably remain a president forever. Otherwise, there would have been a much easier solution to his troubles. Just also change constitution, but not in such a dramatic way. Just eliminate the existing ban to only stay in power 2 consecutive terms.
So you think he's given up on the presidency?
I think that he doesn't want to be president forever. It's very clear. He also repeatedly mentioned
supreme leader.
The fact that he will actually keep in constitution this ban for people who. So
he's going to change the 2 consecutive to 2 terms, full
only,
stop.
Exactly, that's what he said. So that means that no person will be able to stay in power more than 10. Exactly, it's only for him. What is clear is that he seems to be trying to design some kind of Kazakh scenario. We're going to get into that, which allows him to be at the top arbiter, who is an ultimate veto player in the system, but at the same time not too involved in day-to-day, house.
Again, the model
business.
being Iran's supreme leader in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
I mean, Iran's presidents change, and they've changed multiple times, but there is one supreme leader, and he stays there until death.
Kazakhstan actually has much more institutionalized design at this point, as I argue, because Nazarbayev has his daughter and a newly appointed president, essentially 2 people who he trusts. Putin really doesn't have any relatives in politics, and he only has Medvedev, who is probably...
Medvedev's like his puppy.
Exactly. And also probably going to be the person to play the next president's role. There's a lot of hints.
I agree with that. I think that's right. I think that's highly likely. I was disagreeing with a lot of what I considered kind of misinformed, if not naive commentary that was coming out yesterday that this is the end of Medvedev. This is not the end of Medvedev. Where Medvedev goes is important. Medvedev has always been at Putin's side throughout his entire career. And he's always had this junior subordinate role that's made him almost it's made him a punchline, basically the butt of jokes.
He will still carry Putin's books home from school.
He will still carry Putin's books home from school. But the fact that Putin moved him to the Security Council and created this deputy head of the Security Council says to me the Security Council as a body is going to rise in importance.
I suspect exactly that the Security Council is going to be the main player. Already, as you argue, Brian.
State Council could.
It's possible, although State Council right now, its purpose is very unclear, right? It's going to be the body that actually coordinates the regional governors, right? And it's not very clear what kind of authority you're going to put to that body, but we'll see. I mean, so everything's in the flux. I 100% agree with your point that it's very, very flexible. But what we observe, what has really started is actually the dilution among the power branches. Not that there was a lot of, separation of power in the past, but we do with the new constitutional design, the new proposed amendments, they're going to definitely interfere with that even more. And that, of course, longer term is not great for Russia's institutions.
Well, while in the West we have separation of powers, in the Russian tradition, and you remember from the old Soviet Union, the phrase, when Don, you'll remember this, when we were studying Soviet politics back in the 70s and 80s, interlocking directorates, right? The idea of you had all of this overlap between state and party institutions and all of these really complicated flowcharts of, I remember trying to study this and figure out how this thing actually worked, because I was thinking from this Western perspective of a separation of power. We have an executive, legislative, and judicial branch of government. No, you basically had the Politburo was running it. Russia has always been run by oligarchic rule, and that's where power lied, and all the others were just window dressing with interlocking directories.
This is a great point. In a lot of ways, in fact, we are witnessing a step back towards the Soviet system.
Yes.
In fact, the only one that Putin really knows and the only one he really kind of trusts.
Yeah.
That's why this is really not that new for Russia. But also there is a substantive element of personalistic rule there still. That's why I also referenced Iran, since you have this supreme leader who is on top of everything and he has the final say. Although, not to say that it wasn't the case in the Soviet Union also.
And this is one of the reasons why it is different, because if you look at the Soviet system as we understood it for most of the late Soviet period, it was the Brezhnev system, and that was a system of true collective rule.
Yeah.
And where Putin, the power is much more personalized, although it is collective. I think we overestimate sometimes how much power Putin has, but it's not as diluted as it was in the Brezhnev period. The system is very centralized. The last thing I want to go to is the why now question. I have some thoughts on that. They had to get this done before 2021.
Yeah.
They had to get this done before the Duma elections because the surly mood the public is in now, the unpopularity of United Russia, they could have been facing a disaster in those elections that would have colored the transition of power from Putin to Putin. And now they got to get the institutional arrangements done before the
And
the
honestly, I, as a Russia observer, feel badly because I feel like I should have guessed because there was so much hype, so much preparation for this federal address of Putin.
Yeah.
He was literally broadcasted on the buildings in Moscow, in all the subways, in all the metros, and everyone was like making fun of it. Oh, look at this another, indicator of his dictatorship, of his personalistic rule and cult. However, in fact, what it really meant is that he really wanted us to pay attention. He wants to make this point that he is changing things. And in a lot of ways, we're going to go there later, but in fact, in some kind of very bizarre and perverted, I'd say, way, Putin is responding to the social demand because there is a social demand for political change in Russia. And here is his response, the way that he is able to respond to that kind of demand.
Well, it's also interesting that the constitutional change include indexing wages to
exactly.
inflation. And that's going to be put to a public referendum, which is an interesting little poison pill in that referendum.
Which is not really a referendum, though, rather just some kind of vote, right?
Yes, exactly. But this is going to help that. Because it's going to be, people are going to be
100% true.
Don, you're writing furiously.
Yes. Well, let me make a couple of general points because I very much agree with what both of you have been saying. Number one, I think the commentary yesterday was instinctively too Western, which is that the emphasis was too much on institutions and what they're going to do. Because this is just the issue is Putin is going to stay around.
Not our commentary. Not our commentary.
No, because I edited both. But I think we have to not be so preoccupied with institutional arrangements. This is about Putin staying in power. I hate you and I, Brian, got criticized by our viewer for quoting Brzezinski, but let me quote Brzezinski.
Yeah, no, Brzezinski had a good piece today.
Occasionally I agree with him, which is that this is all in Putin's head. The issue is Putin staying around. This debate about Putinism after Putin is now sort of dead because Putin will be there. And so while I very much think it's a very interesting and important and valuable conversation to talk about institutional arrangements and what will eventually emerge, I think whichever emerges, it's still a creature of Putin's personal preferences, thus the personalistic aspect of the system that you and I have talked about, which you had in your article yesterday. So I think we should not get too bogged down in what institutional arrangements
But I think
will
looking at the Potemkin institutions gives
us
clues
related points,
about,
which is the Soviet Union. You and I read Feinsod, or you read Feinsod, and you look at these charts that he had in the book about how it's supposed to work, and it didn't really work that way.
No,
and so
the Politburo
gray areas
everything
that Maria and you talked about yesterday open a lot of possibilities for counterintuitive or maybe about ways that the system will work and be worked out without reference to how it is on paper. And third is, again, the issue of formal versus informal politics. Medvedev still is there. He's not leaving.
He's the de facto vice president.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Brian.
He's the de facto vice president.
He's not been.
No, and this was some of the two things that were driving me crazy about most of the mainstream commentary that was coming out yesterday was this is the end of Medvedev thing, which is totally not true. And the other was that the presidency was being downgraded in favor of the cabinet, which I just don't see any evidence whatsoever for that.
I don't either.
I see the Federation Council, interestingly enough, being upgraded.
A little bit.
But that's going to work out via the informal politics which always run Russia. And a final point I would make is that we didn't use the word. I think Putin's legitimates the system however it's formally arranged. And I think that's why his staying around is very important. Now, it will be very interesting to see if the people who are unhappy with the regime now go to the streets in some way or express their dissatisfaction. We have to see. But the bottom line, Putin's going to remain there. He fixes things to allow him to not be president, but still be in charge. And that, to me, is the bottom line. Brian, I would not say de facto vice president. It's two institutions. He's a de facto number two, maybe.
Yeah, but I mean,
to watch the rats scurry under the rug, see how it works out.
I mean, in the short term, this is actually going to help Medvedev in terms of his public standing because he's no longer prime minister, so he's no longer in the firing line and responsible for how bad everything is going. As the deputy head of the Security Council,
much cleaner.
It's just an easier position to be sitting in, but it's going to be forgive the terminology, Don, an institutionally stronger place to be.
You shouldn't use it. It's just a question of emphasis.
Yeah.
May I
go
just
ahead.
add to that? This is ironically, and I mentioned that in my piece yesterday, exactly the scenario we have seen back in 2005, 2007, when there was another, selection of Putin's successor.
Fradkov, yeah.
Again, Putin appointed a very technocratic, blunt personality. Zubkov and Fradkov, they alternated. We
Which
can't
is
even
funny.
remember in which
Zubkov,
order. Exactly. Nobody have heard about them before that. Nobody have heard about them afterwards.
Right.
However, the real candidates, there was at the time when Putin was
Ivanov,
solving his
Sergei Ivanov and
2008 problem. Yeah, he couldn't stay in power as a president for 2008 for the third term. So he again was speaking between Ivanov and Medvedev. Those two people were again not in any kind of officially known position. In fact, I believe they were vice.
They were their first deputy prime minister, respectively, to first deputy prime minister.
And that is a very, very similar design to what we observe right now. Again, as you said, Medvedev is moved away, so he doesn't get blamed for the economy not doing well. But at the same time, again, he is actually in the de facto vice president position, being the Putin deputy at the Security Council.
Yeah. No,
so this is very interesting. I do not think the system can be as creative anymore. So in a lot of ways, we can rely on the previous precedents in order to be able to judge what's going to happen now.
Yeah, and there was a lot of speculation about whether he was going to report to Patrushev or Putin in that role. It appears he's going to report to Putin.
Oh yeah, there was I think there was a mistake about, honestly, but that was he was going to be a deputy to Patrushev. People
so you have
just
to wonder how
misjudged.
Patrushev.
Well, both of you in your pieces use the word arbiter, which I think is important because, as you said, Brian, it's very important to realize that he doesn't control everything and he has to arbitrate among interests. And I certainly don't think Mishustin would be able to do that. The man with whom no political career has ever been associated.
Yeah, no.
He's actually quite a good technocrat. A lot of people speak very highly of him, of Mishustin. He has done apparently a relatively good job organizing the tax collections, and it also kind of hints at what he's going to be doing right now. Also
useful task collection.
No, I can't say I was expecting him, but I was expecting something like him to be named prime minister. It is downgrading the office of prime minister in a lot of ways. The other thing that's interesting about this is the role of elections in this system. They're creating these power structures that are all completely unelected, which is no surprise. This is how it's kind of making what has always been implicit explicit, right? Because you're going to have. Sure, you can have elections and you can have a different Duma, but the real power is going to lie in these new Politburos.
But there's also a very important element of signaling to the people and to the elites, right? You mentioned, Brian, that it had to be done this year, right? This power transfer scenario. Before 2021, because 2021 is State Duma elections. And by then, the elites have to be signaled about the next arrangement. Because it is true that the elections are not really deciding anything, but before the elections, the power distribution, power transfers, and who is, for example, going to make it to the Duma is decided among key, power players in this regime. So it's important to send them the signal that this is how it's going to be, and in this sense, if you're making it into, so that's why, by the way, Navalny's smart voting in Moscow in September played a role, even if real opposition didn't make it to Moscow Duma. But Navalny interfered for his strategy. He interfered with a regional power redistribution arrangement that existed among the United Russia, Sobyanin, other elite members. And that is, of course, a blow to them because now they have to rearrange these things.
It's going to force the opposition. We can get into that in the second half. The opposition is going to have to change its tactics. The other thing I was thinking, and this you can go to Iran to look at this, what role have elections played in Russia up until now? They've effectively been legitimization rituals.
Exactly.
And now they're not going to be that anymore, though. Because then they're going to have to find a different way to legitimize the regime, because the power is going to lie in this. If we're all correct, and I do think we are, that power is going to lie with the newly created Politburo, whether it's the Security Council or the State Council or some combination thereof, and ultimately with Putin as the supreme leader, whatever title they're going to give him. But elections I think we have to look to Iran to see the role elections are going to
Well,
play.
in Iran, arguably, is a more democratic system than Russia, because in Iran,
This
at
is where I was
least
going.
hypothetically, a new president can be elected, right? We actually witnessed that. Of
Yeah.
course, the new president is not going to be that powerful to fundamental alternative
And
system.
the supreme leader has the ability to manipulate those elections to
As
get
well.
the result he wants. But those elections signal changes in policy direction.
And Iran, in this sense, is more democratic, somewhat ironically, than Russia
But
is.
when you had, it's also about what kind of messages you want to send to the West. When you had Ahmadinejad as president, it was sending a message to the West that we're going to be nasty. When it was Rouhani, it was a message to the West that we're going to be nice.
Yeah.
And it allows the public to kind of blow off steam, but the legitimacy lies elsewhere. Now, in Iran, it lies in in the religious legitimacy that is endowed with the supreme leader. Where's Putin's legitimacy going to come from?
By the way, and Brian, just a very quick note that you actually, I think, just outlined another reason why Medvedev is a very likely successor as a president, right? That's exactly the same signaling that we want to be, because there is really a perception of worsening relationships with the West being a problem in Russia, and having this nice president,
Right.
As in Iran, it would be a signal sent to the West again that we want to renegotiate, we want another reset.
Right.
On the legitimacy, it's a really important point. I saw the observers yesterday commonly asking the question, so why do you worry so much? What changed, right? Putin was going to stay one way or another. Why are you unhappy with what you just heard? It's nothing new. The new thing here is that, as you said, Putin is not elected, even hypothetically elected anymore.
Right.
He is probably going to come up with some kind of design that allows him to
Under the new
be
system,
this
yes.
supreme
Yes,
leader
absolutely.
who is not elected ever. He's a lifelong person in power, and you have not even a hypothetical say over him being there. That is, of course, to the Russians, at least the liberal Russians in the big cities, that is a blow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it does change what the elections are all about. And again, in the second half, we can get into how the opposition.
On the legitimacy, though, it's an important point. Kirill Rogov, a Russian political scientist, recently made this report for Free Russia Foundation, where he actually outlined the previous transition scenarios done in the other post-Soviet republics. Again, very undemocratic, like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and how the succession
Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan too, of course. How the succession problem has been resolved. There's some alternation in the design chosen by each autocrat separately, but the idea is the same. The new guy, the new successor, actually inherits this legitimacy in a very interesting way. So those 80-90% of votes who the previous guy possessed, as long as there is some inter-elite agreement on who the new guy is going to be, he kind of inherits the same 80-90% of votes. Somewhat ironically, we saw that in Russia too back in 2008. Remember when Putin left the presidential position, he appointed Medvedev. Medvedev received a substantive share of votes.
Higher percentage than Putin did. Actually.
But Maria, then in 2011 and 12, when he came back, did Putin why were there demonstrations? I don't disagree with you.
No, that's right. No, we are talking about this side of the political culture. But Russia isn't between Asia and Europe, and so it actually mixes together, interestingly, both political cultures.
Yeah.
This traditionalist political culture is more like smaller cities, Russia, right? But then the big millionaire cities with this younger, modernized population, of course, they are not going to accept that. That is why
Absolutely right.
it is
Absolutely
possible
right.
that some kind of turmoil or unhappiness is going to be more widespread. This is one of the reasons, again, why this is done in 2020. 2020 is the year where we don't have any major elections, the major collective action organizational point, which typically create this outbreak of protests.
So it's a quiet year for the elite to play shell
I do
games.
not think people in Moscow are going to be satisfied with a Putin always behind the scenes, the neo-Ivanishvili maybe,
Right.
and not have a chance to vote on him. Because if you take him out of this and there's no interaction between voting and his tenure in office, I do think that will be a problem.
But that's
It will be a problem, but the regime so far, and here
they can manage it, but
on
it will be a
Brian's side, they
problem.
managed
It'll be a
They
problem.
manage it. Now, before we move into the second half, when we do talk about the society, because that's a whole nother piece and a very interesting piece. I wanted to just drill a little deeper into this Nazarbayev-Kazakh scenario, Maria, that you think is the model. And I always thought from the beginning that you were right about that. Can that be replicated in the Russian context? And what is it for our listeners that are not familiar with the Kazakh-Nazarbayev succession, non-succession scenario? And can it be replicated in Russia?
So one important thing to realize when we talk about it
here too.
is that Nazarbayev's transition has not finished yet, right? We are in transit, so we are not quite sure how this is going to play out eventually.
Right.
There is some actually hints from Kazakh experts that this is not working out as well already. But the key element is that the power of the presidential authority that used to be accumulated all around the president is redistributed across different power branches. In case of Kazakhstan, it's primarily Senate, the upper parliament chamber, which is headed by Nazarbayev's daughter. And also the presidential position is held by a newly elected person who is ally of Nazarbayev. But Nazarbayev himself redistributed a substantive authority, the key elements being the control over the final say over the Silovikis and courts at the level of the Security Council. And as a chairman of the Security Council, he is still the key arbiter, the key veto player, but he doesn't have to engage with day housekeeping on a daily basis. We see that yesterday's announcement of Putin actually hints at very similar design, except that Putin doesn't have daughters or close relatives.
That was the question.
He has daughters, but they're not going into politics.
He has them, but they're not in the politics. Yeah. So and also he probably only has Medvedev, who he trusts, if anyone at all,
it's his puppy.
Given his background also.
It's his puppy.
Yeah. Remember also the background here is important. Unlike Nazarbayev, Putin is from KGB service.
Right.
These people are literally taught not to trust anyone.
Right, where Nazarbayev was a party man, basically.
So that is why I suspect, and as I argue in my article, this design is not going to look as quote-unquote institutionalized as it does in Kazakhstan. It's probably going to be still more personalistic in our case.
And you do see similar. The Federation Council is being raised in stature.
Yeah.
Like this. It's going to be interesting to see who the chairperson of the Federation Council
Exactly.
is.
That was I actually wanted to even discuss that more in my article yesterday. But the thing is that the way he frames it in the address is not very clear. So he kind of hints at the Federation Council getting some powers. But so far, there's nothing real. The appointments are still decided by other offices and bodies. And here, the Federation Council so far only is an advisory body in most positions.
Does the Gulnara Nazarbayeva presence in Kazakhstan make much of a difference? I'm not a Kazakhstan expert, and there seemed to be nobody like that in this system, which I guess supports your point that this is not going to be as clean.
No, Medvedev's playing the role of a family member in a lot of ways.
Just a small correction. Her name is Deriga.
Okay. Finally, the other thing I wanted to talk about. There's some other elements of this that weren't as much discussed. The constitutional changes. The fact that the president can't have dual citizenship. I'm surprised that's not already.
Well, we all thought that was already.
But the fact that Russian law overrides international law is being enshrined in the Constitution, I think, is very interesting.
It's important. It's a very strong signal. But I actually have been listening to the legal experts' commentary yesterday. And the irony of it is that this point is actually already in the Constitution. If there is direct contradiction between the international laws and right of the Russian citizens or fundamental political order in the country, then the Constitution takes priority already. So why do you have to emphasize that again? The question, right? Signaling, exactly. So, and that is not a great signal. Again, another reason why everyone felt quite frustrated yesterday. Probably it's a hint that there's, for example, human rights ruling by the European Court of Human Rights, for example, is not going to be taken as a priority by the Russian courts.
Which that trend has been apparent already.
Yeah, you're both right. It's a signaling that he's rejecting rule-based international institutions, as they say. I have to be fair, and we're always fair on this program. The debate about the supremacy of the U.S. Constitution over other international American commitments has gone on and off over the years here too. But yes, as you said, Brian, it's signaling, it's a rejection of the global order. shouldn't have been expected, but interesting to see how he put it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be now if that kind of clashes with Russia's continued membership in the Council of Europe, because when you sign that treaty, you do say you will follow the rulings of the.
But they always behave inconsistency. They will do it when it serves their interests, and they'll ignore it as they already do when it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, that's a good way to segue. In a few moments, we will continue our discussion and add a new element to all this Kremlinology, the Russian public and how it will react to all of this. I'd like to remind you, you are listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us from the studio is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SIPA.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. From Putin's proposed constitutional changes to Medvedev's career change, this week's power drama in the Kremlin was clearly, carefully choreographed. The one wild card in the picture is the public. Back in 2011, when Putin and Medvedev swapped jobs in the infamous castling, it sparked massive street protests that put the regime on its heels. Maria, you are our public opinion guru. Do you see this? How do you see this playing out?
Well, first of all, thank you for such a flattering description. So, unfortunately, as of now, right, we don't really know how the public is going to respond. It just took place yesterday.
Yeah.
The irony of the whole situation is that I think today or in the next couple of days, the new polls by the state-run or state-linked polling agencies are going to come out with the approvals of Putin. And the puzzle is because those are probably going to reflect the public moods before Putin's announcement.
Because they won't reflect this.
The puzzle is, are they even going to show the poll results to us? You know, if they're not very flattering to Putin, for example, given the whole tensions.
Levada will show
Levada
what they got with us.
So far in the recent months, overall the dynamic has been the same, slow erosion of Putin's approval, but nothing too drastic.
But trust is way down.
The trust has been declining, but again, the biggest blow was still the retirement age increase back in 2018, and since then there was still this dynamic of erosion of these polls. More than that, the actual perception of the economy has been actually stabilizing over the recent months a little bit. So to Putin, they were not, the last months have not been as bad, actually, as you would expect. So what can we say, right? Again, political sciences are horrible in predicting things. So that's why we'll
we
do
both
it.
know, all three of us know from experience. Yes.
We do have certain trajectory in the past, right? First of all, we saw that there was increase in accumulating unhappiness with the way things were. There is a demand for political change, to which Putin tried to respond, as we have discussed in the first part of this broadcast. It is not clear to what extent this is the kind of demand people were looking to receive, right? As we said, the majority, those social groups who are frustrated tend to be the ones who represent the modernizing Russia in the big cities, high educated, those that use internet for access for main news, etc., etc. Those social groups are unlikely to be satisfied with the current option, and they're gonna probably protest in one way or another. Again, as we mentioned before, this year there doesn't seem to be major, points for them to organize around. So there's no major elections, and but again, this is hard to predict. Again, look at Egypt, for example, right? Who knew that a suicide of a merchant will create a revolution? So in this sense, it's absolutely unpredictable. But the dynamic is such, and the authorities' actions, who try to again announce these changes as quick as possible, hint at the fact that no one expects peaceful development of things, right? If things were good, Putin would have waited.
Right. But now let me throw a counterpoint out here. And I'm not sure I believe this, but just let me throw this out there. I mean, there's kind of a paradox in Russian public opinion right now because people are unhappy with the situation as it is, but they fear the chaos because they can't imagine what comes next. Now, by offering cosmetic change, a new president, even though the way things are really run doesn't change one damn bit, are they threading this needle, perhaps?
It's an excellent point, Brian. I think that's definitely part of design of this announcement. And as you said, these populist promises, right?
That are attached to it all.
And also the promise to create some kind of public vote, right? Which is not really a referendum,
Right.
probably not going to be a any decisive power to influence their decisions. But still, certain concessions to the society.
Right.
Hey, I hear you. I see what you want. Here's my way to give it to you. Putin is extremely reliant on the polls. He's really he's praying to the
Right.
polls. And in this sense, we can trust his judgment. He is certainly doing that, keeping in mind
Right.
your hypothesis. How this is going to play out, again, is very hard to predict. I do not think, given the experience, that Moscow, for example, is going to be satisfied. Of course, people are getting increasingly frustrated too.
But enough people would be satisfied that it would not be a threat to the regime.
That's certainly the
kind of
design. And as we know in the past,
they're not going to win over Navalny or his followers, but
the Kremlin's intuition in the past has served them well, right? They're very efficient, and Russia's political culture is such that is very paternalistic, so it allows them to out-design these changes quite successfully. Who knew? Remember when Putin announced this transfer with Medvedev, Rokirovichka? There was so many people saying this is never going to work. Medvedev is going to stay there forever. It is a very weak move on Putin's side. And guess what? It did work out.
Because it was Medvedev. If it was Ivanov, he would have never left.
Well, that's why Medvedev was picked. As I said, Putin has a relatively good judgment at the time. But again, keep in mind, the regime is getting older. Putin is not as young anymore, right? So his best judgment may be also not serving him as well. We will see.
Don, what do you think?
Yes, but I very much agree with what Maria is saying. I do think they have in the past misjudged, however, grassroots sentiment. I assume there's always some guy like Surkov in the Kremlin with really sophisticated poll information. But I think it's perfectly possible they have miscalculated this time, that with a Putin hiding behind the curtain, people will go to the polls, and we've seen them not always control outcomes in Moscow and Petersburg and elsewhere, in cities in particular, and really vote in some people that the Kremlin's not going to be happy with. I think that's a possibility. I like the discussion about how this is and is not 2011-12. I think that, as you said earlier, Maria, the regime's reservoir of legitimacy and stability is wearing out. It may last 10 years. Brian, you and I have talked about this many times. But I do think I think that no matter what he thinks he's doing, the risk is higher today than it was last week.
No, I think we're headed for, in the big picture, I think we're headed for a protracted period of stagnation.
Yeah.
But there's going to be political arrangements within that protracted period of stagnation. And ironically, they're going to look a whole hell of a lot like they did during the last period of stagnation, right? Yes. I mean, the Federation Council is about to become the new Supreme Soviet or Central Committee, or I'm not sure what, but in the either the State Council or the Security Council are becoming the new Politburo. So it's you're seeing kind of this return to, I'm not even sure if it's a return to, because I think it's always been this way, but it's becoming more explicit that this is not a system that even pretends to go through the motions of actual democracy.
This is an extremely important point, how much continuity there is, right?
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, it's actually maybe potentially should change completely our analytical framework, looking at everything that exists as a pure continuity of certain type of the Soviet institutions, where if any attempt to kind of disrupt those institutions like the protests is actually the change, right? Rather than the negative way we're looking at it is that Russia used to be more democratized and developed.
I mean, I would say that this has been continuous for Russia's entire history, is that the Potemkin institutions are ceremonial camouflage. Always have been, and I don't want to say always will be, because that's too lazily deterministic. but they tend in that direction. Go ahead.
So sorry. And one more important point I wanted to make. So when we're making prediction, it's very important to keep in mind that as a KGB officer, Putin likes to surprise.
Yes.
So as you have mentioned very correctly early on in this discussion, the announced changes are very, very unclear, right? He leaves himself with multiple possibilities.
Strategic ambiguity.
Strategic ambiguity. In part, it's his style. He never wants to give out all his cards.
Yeah.
It's also very helpful political strategy, not in order to get himself protected against possible criticism and
He
discontent.
likes to surprise even the people around him. The picture of the week for me was Matvienko, I think Volodin, sitting there looking surprised.
Well, this was tightly held. I
Surprised
think
or
nobody but
disappointed
Putin and Medvedev knew. I think this was
you could see
really,
Matvienko
really...
thinking like, I thought I was a close ally of Putin. And
Well, no, this was tightly held
It was
from
very
what
tightly held.
Venediktov was saying in that on Echo Moskvy yesterday. He was talking to
Very
people
tightly.
very inside who had no idea this was coming. So he didn't want any leaks. He didn't want any speculation.
Played it out really nicely. Again, we should have guessed based on how publicized this whole address has been, unusually, in a very unusual way.
Yeah.
But the point I'm trying to make here is that this is very possible that he has some major changes upcoming that no one knows about. So this is why we have to be careful about making any predictions, because his style is to be able to surprise us at the very last minute always. Unfortunately, he always manages to do that, which doesn't really reflect well on the political analysis of
No, but we do what we can. We just got a set of data points, and we're working with the data points we have.
Yeah,
And the rest is
exactly.
speculation, and analysis is kind of looking at the relationship among these data points and the picture they kind of draw. And I think that's where we are. Last thing before we go, you're Navalny. What do you do now? What do you if you're Navalny, what do you do now?
Yeah, that's a great
How do you? Because he's got.
We're taking notes, Mariano.
If you're listening, Alexei Anatolovich.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that he is going to have to use this discontent that we have discussed, that is accumulating, is probably going to be even more now that Putin has de facto announced his decision to stay in power indefinitely. And probably trying to create some, again, major points which would allow this dissent to organize an outburst.
Yeah.
In the past, just a reminder, now it was not just elections. For example, some Navalny's videos created were very successful and created major outbursts in Moscow, for example, like protest outbursts.
Yeah.
And I have to say, the Navalny team is relatively small, but he really does have a brilliant...
Whom does he go after? Because you're right. I think the corruption videos are actually a good focal point for discontent.
So who is he going to go after next? That's one question. Exactly. His team is very brilliant too. Like Putin is smart, but Navalny's team is very smart too. It's a very interesting power dynamic that's happening there. So we will see what they're going to come up with. In the past, again, they've been able to again achieve certain breakthrough despite the very hostile environment. Like for example, the smart voting campaign, which was a success and unprecedented for Russia, or for example, his anti-corruption videos and investigations.
Don, last word to you before we wrap it up for the week.
Foreign policy note would be that in a gentler time, some of these machinations might have been commented upon or disapproved of in the West, but we seem more tolerant, we being other governments these days, of the rise of more authoritarian leaders. So I think it was a surprise, noted by people, and we all move on.
Well, no, it's baked into the cake that Russia is going to be authoritarian. So that's.
If I were at Navalny, by the way, I think I'd try to take Moscow or something like that and make it about that and corruption and not about Putin.
Right.
Because you can't do much about that.
But interestingly, specifically Putin as a personality has been attracting a lot of negative attention in the past. So it's questionable. So actually on the internet, Putin's federal address has more dislikes than likes.
Oh, that's interesting.
So people are unhappy more specifically with Putin lately, which again, because of Russia's political culture, hasn't been the case in the past.
Right.
So it is questionable to what extent, not using Putin is a great strategy. I think attacking him directly may work quite well.
Okay. All right. Well, on that note, we shall wrap it up. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you have been listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University.
We'll talk about this
and
again.
Also joining us in the studio has been Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you both for the enlightening discussion. I'd also like to thank our producer, Michal Harmata, for keeping the lights on and the complicated machines well-oiled and in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you, you can subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at CEPA.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Join us again next week. And now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.